The first thing anyone in that room noticed was the sound the crystal made when it hit marble, a bright, shameful chime that seemed to ring twice before anyone moved. A wineglass, tipped by a nervous elbow, arced slow and perfect and landed against the Whitmore Penthouse's polished floor. Red bloomed across white marble like a wound. Conversation stopped. Forks paused mid-air. A waiter hovered with the practiced neutrality of someone trained to make messes invisible. Denise Foster reached for napkins before anyone else. She did the work she had always done. Quick hands, practiced motions, as if wiping a stain from cloth could erase the fact she did not belong in the room. When Richard Whitmore III stepped into the spill, his shoes made no sound on the marble. He stood there like a judgment in Italian leather, and his voice folded the crowd to him. "You see what happens when people forget their place?" he said, not really looking at Denise. He looked at the table as if he were inspecting a broken piece of furniture. His words were casual in the way of those who have never had to measure the weight of an insult. Laughter, the small, polite kind, rippled around the room. Guests who had learned long ago which side of power it paid to be on. Preston Foster sat on his mother's hip, ankles dangling above the floor. 10 years old, taped glasses, hair the color of city asphalt. He was slender in a room made for larger shapes. For 10 heartbeats he listened to the laughter as if learning a lesson he had not asked for. The truth was a small thing in him. The room smelled like lemon polish and expensive cologne, like a world that had closed itself around privileges it refused to name. Richard made a show of it. "Denise," he said, "you've cost me $120,000 worth of vintage. You understand the consequences?" He smiled a little to show that he was making room for mercy. "I'll be generous. You can pay what you own, or," he paused to enjoy the arc, "we can settle this with a demonstration of skill." He described the terms as if presenting a game to children. "You know, it's educational, a test of nerve. Either she pays, or she sees how far her family's talent reaches. Her boy plays me for the debt. He wins, she keeps her job and the debt goes. He loses, she owes double." The room inhaled around him. Some of the laughter had the edge of being unsure. He had framed it like a parable, the rich teaching the poor about their place. No one thought to tell him that you did not bet a woman's livelihood like a chip. Or maybe they did and decided silence was safer. Preston's mother's hands went still in his hair. They were hands that kept houses, hands that had learned how to make small things last. Denise straightened, small and proud in universal work clothes, a navy shirt, her badge that said Whitmore Tower Facilities. She would have rather swallowed the debt than let her son step into the spotlight. Richard made a show of it. "Denise," he said, "you've cost me $120,000 worth of vintage. You understand the consequences?" He smiled a little to show that he was making room for mercy. "I'll be generous. You can pay what you own, or," he paused to enjoy the arc, "we can settle this with a demonstration of skill." He described the terms as if presenting a game to children. "You know, it's educational, a test of nerve. Either she pays, or she sees how far her family's talent reaches. Her boy plays me for the debt. He wins, she keeps her job and the debt goes. He loses, she owes double." The room inhaled around him. Some of the laughter had the edge of being unsure. He had framed it like a parable, the rich teaching the poor about their place. No one thought to tell him that you did not bet a woman's livelihood like a chip. Or maybe they did and decided silence was safer. Preston's mother's hands went still in his hair. They were hands that kept houses, hands that had learned how to make small things last. Denise straightened, small and proud in universal work clothes, a navy shirt, her badge that said Whitmore Tower Facilities. She would have rather swallowed the debt than let her son step into the spotlight. And yet, beneath her fear, there was that quiet iron of maternal calculation. Better a single night of risk than a life of doubled servitude. In the corner, a man named Vincent, who ran the building concierge desk, pulled his phone out with the reflex of someone who knew value when he saw it. He hesitated, only to nod to himself, to get the angle that captured the most humiliation for minimum risk. The live icon blinked red. Within seconds, a dozen thin streams of light, follow counts, likes, comments, started to swell. No one had planned a public reckoning tonight, but the city had long ago learned that an unplanned rebuke could travel farther than a planned apology. "Let him play," someone said softly, the sort of voice that wanted something to happen, because watching suffering without a script was unbearable. A chair was brought forward, green felt, a small folding table. The whole thing was set up like a sideshow within a palace. Preston folded onto the chair as if he had been born to it and not thrown into it. He had a way of sitting that suggested patience, of shoulders leveled the way a person who was practiced waiting holds themselves. Before Richard could finish his smile, Preston's grandfather's watch pressed into his palm, warm, cheap, with a face long stopped at 3:42. William Foster had wound that watch until the spring grew tired. He had given it to Preston 2 summers before, when the boy first asked about the cards. "Remember this," William had said. "Time doesn't move for a man who's trying to make you feel small. Tuck that stillness in your hand." Vincent's camera panned close, Denise's jaw working, Preston's taped glasses, Richard ordering whiskey with the casual air of a man never asked to show his hand. There was a certainty in the room, a soft arrogance that comes from years of being surrounded by people who nod when you speak and look away when you need them to. No one thought about power shifting in a way that wasn't meant to be seen. If a camera had a heartbeat, it would be thrumming at that moment, live. Comments flowed in. "Is this real? Bet him. Dude, this is insane." Among the bystanders, not everybody laughed. Some watched with the discomfort of human beings who don't like to be on the wrong side of a story. Eleanor Davis, the executive assistant, stood nearer the kitchen doorway than anyone else, a clipboard in her hand and a knot in her throat. She had tidy hair and an even gaze, the sort of person who archived things because the world seldom offered receipts. She remembered the way Richard had spoken to Denise last year about hours missed, the way words had been privileges withdrawn. Her fingers tightened on her clipboard. She had an email draft open in her head, a file of grievances she had never filed. James Wilson, a security guard who had spent nights in smoky card rooms decades ago, watched with a layered expression that mixed recognition and something like pity. He had hands that remembered shuffling and a body that had learned to read tiny human tells like they were weather. He saw posture, a stray blink, the way someone set their shoulders. He could tell you a lot about what people are willing to risk when they are trying to scare someone. Richard slid a chip, thick and lacquered, across the table like a judge dropping a gavel. "Make it interesting," he said. "All deal." The room rearranged itself into an audience. Some of the guests pretended no one could see their phones, but under small palms the warm glow indicated they were recording. The air conditioning hummed at its usual steady pitch, an industrial sigh on the 63rd floor. It was the same sound that had filled the building for as long as anyone could remember, and for all the money in the room, money could not buy the silence of the old hum. William Foster's voice came back to Preston quietly, through memory. "Cards teach you numbers and people," he'd said, leaning in with the gravity of a man who had kitted out the world with experience. He'd taught Preston to count the deck in ways that were not superstitious. How many cards make a flush, what a straight looks like, how people look when they are trying to hide fear. "A lot of men fold before they have to," William said, tapping the watch with a finger that had knuckles like river stones. "They fold because the room says they are small. Don't be those men." Preston's fingers were still when the chips rattled. He breathed in the steady smallness he kept like a secret, the kind of breath that had been practiced because the world had required patience. He did not play to be noticed. He had learned the hands by heart, by the hum of William's voice, by the math that turned a shuffle deck into an equation you could solve. The dealer, one of Richard's men, an extra from a charity gala who thought he had the inside of the game, fanned 2 cards to Preston and 2 to Richard with a showman's flourish. There was a moment before the downbeat of hands when the air shifted. Everyone silently acknowledged that something was actually happening. That instant held a small universe: risk, humiliation, and the old modern hunger for spectacle. Preston's cards felt like a private truth. He glanced at them only once. 7 of spades, 8 of spades. Small cards, people would say. Insignificant. William had smiled at that hand years ago and called it a weather hand. Not because it won by itself, but because it told you which storms might pass and when. 2 spades, connected by 1 rank. A hand that could do many things if you knew how to let it become more. Richard's hand was AK, offsuit, regal, loud. A lot of players like AK before anything else happened because it had authority, a promise. He chuckled, flashed a ring. The room liked that kind of promise. It seated itself like a cushion across Richard's shoulders. "Preston," Richard said, leaning in, a look of pity that was meant to be degrading.
"You got nerve, kid. I respect that. But remember what this table is. It's not a schoolyard. It's where adults show children how the world is run." The phrase, "how the world is run," was a curtain lifted by very few. Richard knew how to make the rules look natural. Preston didn't answer. He'd listened to people tell him what the world would be since he was small. Teachers, bill collectors, neighbors, and he had learned to keep his answers measured. Words wasted were chips folded. He folded his hands in his lap the way a person who knows what they are doing keeps their hands when a room is angry. The first betting round was small, ceremonial. Richard pushed money forward, enough to make the point and keep the stakes visible. The guests watched, their drinks held like scepters. Someone gasped silently when the stack increased tenfold. Denise watched too, but not the way she once watched a TV game show where luck chosen by producers made ordinary people winners. Denise watched with the terror of arithmetic. Her ledger at home, the amount she could cobble together, the months of missed rent. When the flop was dealt, 3 cards on the table, a tiny storm broke in Preston's chest. The board showed 4 of spades, 5 of diamonds, 6 of spades. For most of the room it was a string of mundane numbers. For Preston, who had been taught to see lines in things others thought random, it was the moment the hand announced itself. The 4, 5, 6, together with his 7 and 8, made a straight. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Exact, quiet, undeniable. 2 spades on the board matched his 2 spades in hand. There were already 4 spades visible. If you had been watching for the smallest shift, you would have noticed it on James's face first. A flicker of the old gambler's recognition, the trained muscles of someone who has seen a hand settle like a tide. The hum of the AC seemed to lower a degree. A fork clinked against a plate somewhere behind his shoulder. Preston felt something the size of a footprint leave the world and be replaced by a new weight. He did not make a sound. He could feel the watch at his wrist like a talisman under the skin. Denied the luxury of time by the watch's frozen face, he moved into numbers without hurry. The straight was made. That meant that on the flop, given the known cards, Preston's hand was already ahead. The math, cold, almost cruelly precise, tilted in his favor. There were very few sequences of 2 cards to come that could improve Richard's position into a full house or a better straight. They existed, but like a probability you could touch and dismiss. Vincent's camera shifted closer, fingers shaking now from the thrill or the fear of what he had recorded. The live feed, which had been a crimson heartbeat, began to pulse faster. Comments poured in, instantaneous waves. "No way. He's 10. This is wrong." And then, in a small, sharp voice, he could win. That tiny whisper traveled within text and emoji to places beyond the room, to phones, to strangers who would soon decide which side to take. Richard's face changed.
For the first time, he looked like a man surprised to discover a fact he had not paid for. He tapped a chip with a knuckle. He adjusted his cuff. He made a move that said he was still in control, and the move was designed to reassert dominion, a small raise measured to bully and to bait. Preston looked at the bet like a sum to be solved. The raise had a name: pressure. The room called it spectacle. For Preston, it was an arithmetic problem layered over a history. His grandfather had shown him how to treat the table as an extension of your thinking. 120 numbers are on that felt, Presto, William had said, using the nickname he'd given the boy. You learn which of those numbers speak like people. He taught him to watch the angle of a wrist when someone lied, how an eyebrow drops when fear travels like water. A man's hands are the loudest thing he'll give away, he told him, fingers stained with tobacco and time. Preston pushed in a modest all. Not a challenge, but an acceptance of the terms as they stood. That steadiness, someone having the courage to keep numbers in mind instead of letting others shout them, started to change the room's temperature. The laughter that had been there at the beginning thinned like fog. Richard studied him with a predator's curiosity. He was used to folding men for their insolence. He was not used to a child who wore patience like armor. He made another, wider bet, loud enough that the sound of the plastic chips scraping carbonated air seemed theatrical. It was a statement. A man who paid for his world was now buying a spectacle. Onlookers leaned in. Eleanor felt the pattern in her chest again, a moral calculus she hadn't had time to name. She had been in charge of scheduling, of smoothing over crises, of booking flights and ordering flowers. She had a folder of things she had seen, emails where Richard berated interns, a list of phone numbers of employees he'd cut off. She watched him now in the small theater of the card table and felt the rails of her own conscience shift. That night, standing near the doorway with a clipboard like a shield, she made a decision that would not be immediate but would ripple later with the force of a thrown stone. Richard's son, Thomas, sat at a small table with a glass of champagne and a face that tried to seem indifferent. He was young, suited in the casual way of those reared in privilege. He had prospered in a world constructed by his father's will. Yet there was something in his eyes that had always been unsettled by cruelty disguised as humor. Thomas watched his father now with a hand at his mouth, the tremor of empathy trying to find language in a place that had none. The dealer flipped the next card, the turn. It was the 9 of hearts, red, harmless in appearance, like a polite applause after a line had been spoken. The 9 did not change the mathematics of Preston's advantage, but it introduced new texture to the room, an extra beat where a man might think to rally or to accept. Richard scowled and brought a cigarette to his fingers, though there was no permission for smoking. It was a gesture drawn from old habits, to make himself look calm. "Show me a card," one of the guests said, the sort of helpless command people make when they hope theater will supply them with moral clarity. Richard flashed a smile like a blade. He threw his cards down, ace, king. He pushed them forward in a way that invited applause for theater, an offering to say he had been magnanimous. People clapped politely. Someone near the windows laughed, not sure why. Preston looked at the table and then at his own hand. He could see how the room had rearranged itself around his quiet. He remembered William's last lesson, the one that had been said softly in the glow of a single lamp. "Don't let a man's noise drown the thing that's true on the table," William had said. "If your hand is what it is, let it stand like a fact. No need for fireworks." To Preston, the hand on the felt was a fact. He slid his cards back to the table deliberately, the motion of a person who is asked to speak and chooses the exact moment. He turned them over. 7 of spades, 8 of spades. The room inhaled like it had been waiting at a crosswalk for a light to change. The sequence, 4 of spades, 5 of diamonds, 6 of spades, together with Preston's 7 and 8, made a straight. The sound that followed was not a single noise, but a compartmentalized cascade. A fork clattered, someone's phone pinged, a child at another table began to cry hours away in a memory. Richard's face went through stages. First, denial, a flush you see in people who have yet to code unusual facts into language. Then irritation, then fury, the complicated blend of a man who had been shown that money could not buy this particular rule. Preston did not shout. He slid his cards forward with the precise calm of someone returning what belonged to him and nothing more. The cameras caught his hands, the cheap watch blinking stillness at 3:42 against his wrist. Vincent's live feed exploded. The viewer count doubled and then doubled again, like a string of bulbs being switched on. Comments that had been ironic were now emphatic. People were choosing sides the way they choose punchlines, and somewhere past the penthouse windows, the city folded the story into its constant hum. Richard put on a face of control that cracked at the seams. "That's impossible," he said, too loudly, the sentence more a weapon than a protest. He looked at the dealer, trying to find a fault in the choreography of cards. The man shrugged as if to say, "The deck is shuffled. The cards are not here to justify themselves to you."
"You cheated," Richard said, with the sort of accusation that seeks to repaint truth as an act of malfeasance. He pointed at Preston as if the boy had personally rearranged the order of the deck. The word cheated filled the room like smoke. For a moment, people held their breath, not knowing which way to turn their attentions. James Wilson felt a memory anchor in his gut. Men had accused others of cheating when the stakes were beyond their control. He'd seen men turn that way before. He rose, the way people do when muscle memory of what is right collides with fear. "You want him checked?" James said. His voice had the quiet authority of someone who had lost and learned and wanted an honest table. Eleanor had already moved. She had the camera footage on her phone. Images of Richard's earlier outbursts framed and dated in the folder she had kept 3 months ago. The list of times Denise had been disciplined for missing a family emergency. The name of the man who had promised to cover unpaid fines and then rolled his eyes. She took a breath that tasted like obligation and moved closer, hands steady despite the tremor of adrenaline that made her heart beat like a faster clock. She had the power of archives in her fingertips, and tonight that power was a soft weapon. The crowd split in a way that was physical and moral. Guests who had laughed before found pathways to the doors. The staff, who had long been invisible, rallied in small acts that felt like a tide with many hands. A waiter refused to pick up the fallen host's wineglass. A maid stopped cleaning another table as if suddenly visible. Whispers traveled like small flames. Vincent, whose finger had started the cascade by turning the humiliation into a live commodity, felt the weight of his phone in a new way. He had meant to capture a moment of spectacle. He had not expected the moment to turn into something that might not be so friendly to its originator. His feed mushroomed, and mixed in with shock were people asking for names, for consequences, for justice. The comment feed thrummed with the city's long archive of indignation. Preston kept his face neutral, the way you keep numbers when you have to solve them and don't want to make a show. William's lesson returned like a light in the dark. Let the truth be loud on the felt. Do not make the room louder than your hand. He watched Richard's chest heave, measured the man's breathing and the way he touched his chips with a finger that now trembled. He had learned tells not to gloat, but to read. For him, poker was a way to learn rate, probability, patience, skills his grandfather had folded together with stories about men who thought power walked on end. Outside the room, the city began to name the event. Hashtags formed like small flags. Hashtag Whitmore Bet trended for a minute in a city that skinned tomorrow's news on a loop. Strangers messaged friends, "Have you seen this?" People who had never met Preston's family felt invested by the simplicity of an unjust man being shown a fact. Richard stood abruptly, and the chair legs groaned. His voice rose. "I demand a recount. I demand a check of the deck."
He moved the folding table as if to seize the chips, to reassert that he could still control the algebra of the night. His movement was old as power itself. If you can't win by the rules, change the frame. Thomas watched his father's motion with the wide, sudden disquiet of someone starting to understand which parts of his upbringing were elective cruelty. He rose and walked to his father's side, but did not settle into his old posture of automatic approval. This small dissent might have meant nothing if it had been only a look, but the hour had elongated into something that made him see whether he wanted to be the son of this man. Eleanor took out her phone and began, quietly, to record. Not the live moment Vincent had made viral, but the things Richard had said in private memos and offhand comments caught on Bluetooth months before. The emails that showed a pattern rather than a single act. She did not post them then. She knew how to collect a narrative the city could not ignore. Documentation, timestamp, witness. Her hand shook only when she scrolled to a saved message where Denise was written off for needing a day off for her son's doctor. That small cruelty, once compiled, could not be shrugged away by a man's arrogance. The dealer pushed a glass of water forward as if to make the table into a stage of civility. The methodical white light above the cards moved like a lighthouse. The green felt held the small dramas of the night, the map of power and the literal place where it was being rewritten. The watch on Preston's wrist did not move. 3:42 stayed frozen like a vow. A ripple of cell phones rose. People recorded the argument, posted clips with captions that bent the story into frames they wanted to see. Some condemned Richard immediately. A few offered condescension toward Preston. The city listened in little bursts, an eyebrow raised here, a gasp there. The room, which had once been a sea of agreement, now looked like a body that had been startled awake. Preston met his mother's eyes for the first time. She mouthed, without sound, "Be steady." He nodded minutely. He thought of William, his smell of coffee and lemon oil, of nights counting cards as if they were stars to be mapped. He felt the math rise up like the tide, a pattern that was both practical and moral. The hand at the felt had become larger than its two players. It was a question: what happens when a system designed to silence lifts its skirt to the light? How did a boy keep his dignity when his mother's life had been placed on the edge of a bet like an afterthought? As the room negotiated answers, the live viewer count on Vincent's stream kept rising. It passed through mere curiosity into a kind of collective intensity. People who had been strangers before now held opinions shaped by seconds on a screen. The power of a phone was not only to show, but to name. What had been private humiliation a moment ago was now a public moment with witnesses who would not be pinched back into silence. The dealer asked for the river card when no one wanted to breathe. The motion of the deck was small, almost tender. A tray of crystal glasses trembled somewhere behind a shoulder. For a few seconds, the hum of the AC was the only sound that felt like it belonged. William's voice, in a memory that was no longer distant, said one last thing: "If you play with truth, it'll hold you. Don't get loud when it does." Preston held that thought like a small instrument and let it guide him as he watched the card flip. Just then, someone upstairs, no one could tell who, opened the heavy blinds, and the city light spilled into the penthouse in thin bars. Richard blinked, and for one split second, the Manhattan skyline seemed to judge him more than any person did. The light made the green felt look greener, and the crystal look brittle. It made Preston's taped glasses catch a sliver of light like a promise. There was a knock at the service door, and a staff member stepped in holding a small stack of legal pads. An innocuous thing, but it felt like another witness, another person who had crossed the line between being invisible and being present. He had a pen behind his ear and a look that said he had seen more than his job title gave him credit for. In a place stacked with wealth, the smallest gestures of visibility counted. Richard, feeling the room shift, sharpened his tone. He demanded an explanation, a recount, a rewinding of the night. But the facts on the felt were stubborn in a way that money could not be. The straight existed. Cards do not care for the fortunes of men. They lie inert and true until you interpret them honestly or choose not to. The conversation at the table had become a duel of narratives, one man demanding the pain he wanted to inflict be legitimized, and the congregation, people who had watched him all night without speaking, beginning, in fits and starts, to move away from the story he wanted to tell. Eleanor's thumb hovered over her phone, the image she had been taking, a thing that would one day be a folder, a list, a record that could be used to build a case not in a court of law, but in the pillory of public opinion. She did not act yet. She was not impulsive. This was the calculus of someone who knew that the last thing you want to do in a moment like this is to rush the truth. She would later learn to time her release, to let the wave hit when it could sweep the biggest things away. The hush at the table was not silence so much as attention. It felt like people holding their program in the theater until the final bow. What would happen when the last card was shown? Who would clap? Who would turn away and pretend nothing had happened? There were loyalties loosening like threads. Preston's mother folded her hands in her lap until the knuckles whitened. She remembered how William had taught a younger Preston to play not for money but for understanding. He had said, "People will bet on what's loud. You bet on what's true." She had an old ledger in the drawer at home in which she kept receipts and reminders of days when the rent had been late and the landlord had been kind. Tonight, the ledger seemed irrelevant. This was not accounting as she knew it. This operated on a different scale, where a moment's dignity could translate into months of breathing room. The dealer's hand hovered over the final card. No one knew how the sequence would land, and yet everyone felt like they knew the moral arc that should carry the night. Humiliation answered by a boy's quiet competence. But life is never that theatrical, and in the short windows between beats, true consequences begin to sputter into being. A viral video that could topple reputations, a witness with a folder, a son who no longer wished to inherit his father's permission to belittle others. When the river card slid out of the deck and settled on the felt, two of clubs. The last card lay flat for a breath that felt like an ocean between two breaths. The two of clubs was small and harmless, a punctuation that did no harm to the arithmetic on the felt. It did nothing to dismantle the quiet fact already staring up at them. A 5-card run, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, neatly aligned across the green. Preston's hand, which had been a private homework problem only minutes before, had become a public truth. Silence broke first from unexpected places. A napkin dropped to the floor, an indrawn breath at the window, a waiter's tray clinking into a corner. Then something without choreography rose, brief and truthful, the sound of people shifting their weight away from the man who had thought he could buy the room's consent. Before any of the formalities of outrage could be arranged, the human documentarian that was the internet took its first unstructured breath. Vincent's live feed, which had started as a tasteless spectacle, became a primary source. The viewer count rocketed. Comments spilled sideways, some defending, some outraged, many simply stunned. People on the street outside the tower would later tell reporters they'd watched a clip on their lunch break. Someone halfway across the world would forward a time-stamped grab to a friend in another time zone. The city was already beginning to translate the event into a chorus. Richard's face was an anatomy of anger. He reached for the chips as if he could physically displace the fact from the felt. "Shuffle again," he barked, voice cracking in a way the wealthy seldom let themselves sound. "Check the deck. Check the—" James stood before him, not as a challenger, but as a witness. His voice was low. "We saw the cards, Mr. Whitmore. We all did." There is authority in remembering what you saw and saying it plainly. The staff, tightened by years of small humiliations,
had found a seam. Small things, denied breaks, unpaid fines, had added up into a ledger of grievance in their pockets. Tonight, that ledger began to be read aloud. Some in the room still hemmed at the edges, trying to pick safe narratives. Perhaps the cards had been switched, perhaps someone had slipped something into the deck. But the dealer, an awkward man chosen to fill a role he did not understand, shrugged and opened his hands. The deck had been cut and shuffled in plain sight. Cards lay where they fell. The mathematics did not change. The room could not pretend the truth away. Richard's accusation of cheating had been posed like a weapon. The charge landed, and then, under the light of everyday witnesses and video feeds, lost its edge. If there was a wound in the evening, it was at the place where the wealthy man thought his voice could make reality bend. Eleanor, whose hand had been on a clipboard when the embarrassment unfolded, reached for her phone again. This time she did not live stream for likes. She was assembling a case. She had been collecting sharp things for months: emails, screenshots, instances of patterns that looked like bullying, and what she possessed was not a weapon of revenge, but an inventory. She recorded a short clip, not just the card reveal, but Richard's earlier comments about Denise, the tone that had been habitual. She made a few notes, times, dates, witnesses, and then slid the phone back into her bag with the kind of attention people pay to something serious. She had the habit of making evidence stolid and organized. The internet would do the rest. Outside, the news cycle that moves in tiny pulses of outrage and empathy had been given oxygen. The clip densified with captions and context. Wealthy CEO mocks cleaning woman, bets her job on a 10-year-old. The story was a scaffolding easily built by a social media economy that rewards moral clarity. Hashtags clustered like tidelines. Ordinary users reposted with indignation. Micro-influencers added commentary. A local reporter, following a tip, sent a terse query to the Whitmore PR address. An intern at a television station clipped the feed for the morning segment. The moment was brittle with vulnerability. It could be washed away, or it could change a life. Within the penthouse, the social choreography began to crack. Guests who had laughed at the start now looked away, scanning for exits that matched their discomfort. Some of them had bills and jobs that did not demand ethical clarity the way their stomachs did. That is to say, their compassion was calibrated to convenience. Yet, a surprising number of those present could not meet the look of someone they had just seen diminished and not feel an awkwardness that edged into action. Thomas Whitmore rose, and his movement spoke more than the words he might have used. He did not storm the table, nor did he make a show. He simply walked to his father, placed his palm on Richard's sleeve, and met his gaze. No approval, no shame, but a new questioning. "Dad," he said softly, a small voice that did not want to be just another echo in a dynasty. It was little, yet becomings are often began by small things. For Richard, the night had taken on the texture of a loss that money could not purchase back. He had always counted, and the room had always counted with him. But when the crowd's count changed, when the faces at the edges of power began to withdraw their consent, the basis of his performance faltered. Humiliation, when redirected, has a corrosive effect on the stage-managed self. The immediate aftermath of the hand had a choreography of its own. Vincent's feed multiplied, and with it came strangers who felt they were in on something. "This is wrong," one comment read. "We should do something," another said. The people who could have spoken up when Denise had been belittled earlier, guests, executives, acquaintances, found that the weight of witness had shifted from the side of the wealthy man to a broader public. The roll call of conscience rearranged itself around a video. What the video could not do alone was to transform structural power at the click of a mouse. But video plus archives, plus a steady, credible witness, could change the calculus. Eleanor, knowing how to create a pattern rather than a single point, reached out to a journalist she trusted. She arranged a time to share her folder.
She did not act rashly. She timed her release when it could be corroborated, when people could not easily contest the shape of what she offered. There is an art to authority. Be accurate, be patient, be prepared. Over the next 24 hours, the story migrates from the living room of the Penthouse to a broader public square. Clips of the hand appear across networks. Local radio hosts replay the decisive seconds and invite commentary. Editors assemble the basic facts. Denise humiliated, bet proposed, Preston plays, Preston wins, and place them against a backdrop of documented incidents. Eleanor's compiled emails are a thread. Her voice, at first cautious, becomes clearer as she supplies timestamps and names. James, whose job did not ask him to become a moral arbiter, gives a short on-camera statement about what he saw and the way the staff reacted. He is steady and unadorned. Vincent, at first embarrassed by the way his feed had been used and then astonished at its reach, gives an interview in which he admits he had filmed for a spectacle and was humbled by the outcome. These smaller confessions shape a single narrative arc that is almost impossible to dismiss as a fluke. The Whitmore office responds first with denial, procedural and thin. A short statement emphasizes that an internal review is underway. The language is crafted by counsel, measured, preventing liability while seeking distance from the spectacle.
But words on a press release are not the same as the texture of conscience revealed in 100 employee inboxes. Clients, all unnamed in the public record for legal reasons, start to question the optics. Friends at the edge of business relationships pick up the story and wonder if association with a man now caught on film belittling an employee is defensible. Boards are creatures that respond to numbers as much as reputation. The kind of sustained negative attention that followed the clip touches metrics boards pay attention to: brand perception, client inquiries, market whispers. The board chairs at firms that had once been comfortable in Richard's orbit begin, privately, to discuss risk. They do not broadcast those conversations. They forward memos and prepare for the possibility that a once sure ally had become a liability. The businessman learns, slowly, that social accounting accumulates in the ledger of the market. Within a week, small retributions accumulate that are plausible and powerful without being melodramatic. A few corporate partners pause negotiations. Invitations to speak at conferences are quietly rescinded. Donors rethink their association with charitable ventures that had Richard's name attached. The exact ways in which wealth withdraws its patronage are mundane: emails, canceled appointments, deferred events, but they are the sort of slow-acting erosion that topples reputations that refuse to bend. People who once called him a leader now prefer not to broadcast their intimacy. Meanwhile, the staff of the Whitmore building, the people who knew Denise best, begin to come out of the margins in ways both small and consequential. A group of employees organize a petition demanding a formal apology and structural changes to the way such incidents are handled. They ask for clearer discipline policies, for anti-harassment training, for the right for staff to report without fear of reprisal. It is not radical. It is practical, and it carries the momentum of people who have been made visible. Thomas Whitmore's reaction is a hinge. He writes an internal note, brief and cutting, that he cannot endorse his father's behavior. He reaches out to Denise, not with a performative check-in, but with a quiet apology. The moment is a storm in a teacup for some, but for him it is a beginning of a moral realignment. He appears later in a short video, volunteer shuffling cards at a community center. It is not a PR stunt, but a personal grappling with what it means to inherit power responsibly. Richard, pushed into a press conference he is ill-equipped to perform sincerely in, offers a statement that falls flat. The words are measured, the tone is impatient. His resignation, when it happens, weeks later, comes from corporate pressure. Clients asked for meetings. The board felt the risk. They presented options, which Richard, accustomed to choosing with money, misunderstood as suggestions rather than necessities. He left with a short, formal announcement and a few loyalists in his wake. No violent downfall, just the slow, precise unwinding of a man whose moral capital had been spent. During that unspooling, Preston and his family had to decide what the sudden attention meant in practical terms. Calls came from strangers bearing scholarship offers. An older woman in a local nonprofit suggested media training, and a university with a long-standing outreach program sent a polite, measured letter expressing interest in learning more. Preston received them all with a modesty that matched his demeanor at the table. He was not eager for the spotlight. His grandfather's lessons about truth, about patience, about the dignity of the game, kept him level. Denise, who had been the brunt of humiliation, received apologies in various forms. Some were private and careful, some were performative and public. She measured them with the ledger of experience and decided which to accept. The most consequential decision she made was not to accept any single big donation meant to salve the immediate harm, but to insist on something that would last: the creation of a community program that would teach the skills her son had shown on the felt, probability, observation, patient decision-making, to kids who might otherwise have been invisible to their city's more affluent institutions. She called it, quietly, Grandpa's Table. The name honored William Foster, who had taught Preston that cards can be a language of numbers and people. The program would not be a gambling school. Its curriculum focused on math, logic, teamwork, and dignity, the kind of training that turns a noisy world into a field of solvable problems. They would teach kids how to think about odds, about reading intentions, about making choices under pressure. It was a small program in its first years: folding tables, green felt, donated decks of cards, volunteers from the neighborhood. But it was a seed, deliberate and rooted. James, who had spent nights in smoky rooms that smelled like old money and bad decisions, volunteered on Wednesdays. He taught shuffle technique and table etiquette, the small skills that make a room honest. He told the kids stories about hands he'd seen and how people told truth with a twitch of a finger. He was careful to emphasize that cards were tools for learning, not a promise of easy money. The program taught counting outs, simple fractions, the logic of pot odds in plain language. If you need one card to complete a run, you have about an X chance. And it gave kids practical ways to approach risk without romanticizing gambling. Eleanor, whose folder had moved the story from gossip to pressure, took on a role she hadn't planned. She became the program's organizer and archivist-in-chief. Her skills in documentation and timing were now channeled into building curricula and creating partnerships. She reached out to community colleges, to teachers who worked in after-school programs, to local funders who preferred modest accountability to large, showy donations. Her work was slow and careful and less glamorous than the viral clip that had launched it. But it was exactly the sort of structural response that holds. The city, which had seen many small spectacles, watched as a narrative shifted from a single moment to an ongoing project. People who had retweeted the clip found themselves invited to a folding table in a church basement to watch kids learn probability with decks of cards. The intimacy of that scene, tiny hands sliding cards under cheap fluorescent lights, the hum of conversation, became the story's softer half. Cameras that had taken a single click for outrage now held longer lenses for the work of repair. Preston's public profile expanded in careful increments. He did not seek interviews. When a local paper asked for a profile, he agreed to a short piece that focused on his grandfather more than himself. He described William's small rules: clean your watch, count the deck, don't let men's noise drown the truth on the felt, and the piece centered a quiet lineage. Offers for scholarships came with strings and without. Some were generous with conditions he and Denise did not find comfortable. They chose instead to accept a small academic fellowship for young thinkers from a community college that promised mentoring and a path to summer courses in math. The fellowship was modest, bureaucratic, and unglamorous. It fit who Preston was, someone who preferred to be prepared over being celebrated. There were discouraging moments. Richard's name did not disappear overnight. His network included people who prefer private settlements to public contestation. He retained a circle of loyalists. But the momentum had shifted toward accountability. When the board that had once given him cover convened to repair reputational damage, they found fewer friends willing to be publicly allied.
In private, donors and partners expressed discomfort. In public, a few issued statements emphasizing dignity and respect for employees. Words mattered less than action, and action came in many small forms. Policy revisions, review boards for staff grievances, commitments to anti-harassment training programs. In those weeks, as the institutional story resolved itself into incremental reforms, Preston and Denise focused on building something that could outlast the news cycle. Grandpa's table started in a church basement with 6 folding tables and a notice pasted on the community board. A woman in the kitchen baked a small sheet cake for a soft opening. They used it as a fundraiser and a way to welcome families. Word spread slowly and then with a quiet confidence. A boy who had been asked to play to save his mother's job had learned enough to build a ladder for others. The program primer was deliberately simple.
Sessions began with an hour of problem solving, using cards as visual aids for fractions and probability. Volunteers used simple metaphors, outs as missing puzzle pieces, to teach the calculus of risk. Kids learned what a straight looked like, not to win money, but to understand sequence and chance. They learned to observe the tilt of a wrist, the speed of a blink, what a hand looks like when someone is bluffing. The classes included ethics, what it meant to use skills with responsibility, how to refuse games that treated people like theater. Preston taught a module he called Watch and Wait, an homage to Williams' stopped Timex. He taught kids how to sit still with their thoughts until the facts were clear, how to keep a hand in reserve and not be fooled by noise. Williams' watch, the cheap one that had been stopped at 3:42, became an emblem. It was hung on the program's corkboard with a small plaque. If your time is stolen by anger, keep this stillness in your palm. The symbolism was quiet and precise. The first group of kids who graduated from Grandpa's table did not appear on television. They showed up at a local math fair, shy and steady, and placed well in a team problem-solving contest. Parents sent emails thanking the program for providing something children could carry into school, a way to make decisions with math rather than fear. A teenage volunteer who had lost 2 jobs to erratic hiring practices found dignity in the role, teaching younger kids how to apply for internships and read contracts. The restorative effect of a modest program is rarely dramatic, but it is durable. Months later, when the story of the Penthouse had moved from trending headlines to a case study in workplace dignity, Preston felt the world he had briefly encountered settle behind him like a door. Offers, scholarships, television appearances kept arriving. He declined many, accepted a few, always with Denise's measured advice in his ear. "We take what helps us build," she told him. "We don't take what begs us to perform." Her guidance was a household rule: keep your work useful. There were moments of temptation to leverage the story into something more personal, book deals, speaking circuits, but the family kept the work local. They chose to scaffold other people's opportunities rather than monetize the wound. It is a moral posture that sustains a different kind of legacy, one that extends the watch's stopped minute into an instruction not to be hurried into spectacle. Years later, the Penthouse event is still a story people reference when discussing power and accountability in the era of instant witness. It is an example of how a single smartphone clip, paired with careful documentation and the slow work of community building, can turn a moment of cruelty into a catalyst for change. The details they remember, the green felt, a cheap watch stopped at 3:42, a 10-year-old with taped glasses, have become motifs in local teaching. Teachers in after-school programs hand out small timers and say, "Remember the watch. Let the facts be loud on the felt." William Foster's watch remained in a shoebox in Denise's closet for a long time, until a volunteer suggested it be placed on the wall of Grandpa's table. They hung it there, and the stopped hands faced anyone who walked in. Kids would poke at it, ask why the hands were still, and Preston would tell the story not with the edge of triumph, but with the steady patience that had gotten him through a night of humiliation. "My granddad said time doesn't move for a man trying to make you feel small," he would say. "So we keep the watch where we can see it, and don't let their noise change what is true." The program grew slowly. Neighbors helped with donations. Local colleges provided tutors. Thomas Whitmore, in an ongoing act of small restitution, volunteered on weekends to help kids with STEM projects and to teach them about corporate responsibility from the lens of someone who had begun to ask hard questions about inherited power. His presence was not a headline, it was a practice, an individual choosing to recalibrate what had once been default. Denise, who had kept books for years and who carried an old ledger like a talisman, became the program's coordinator. She learned to write grant applications and to balance budgets. She developed a knack for explaining complex things plainly, the same skill she had applied to stretching paychecks into months. Her dignity, which had been questioned in a single cruel sentence on that fateful night, became a quiet model for hundreds of families that came to the table looking for steadying routines. There were hard lessons along the way. The work of building trust in communities is messy. People arrive with suspicions, with histories of disappointment. The program did not solve poverty. It offered tools and dignity. It taught kids to count cards as metaphors for choices, to see odds as a language for decision-making, and to keep their gaze level in rooms that are designed to make them feel small. That last lesson, the one William had insisted on, proved to be the program's most durable gift. For Preston, the fallout of the Penthouse night was not an arc of instant heroism. He continued to be a boy who loved numbers and who sat quietly with his thoughts. He did well in school, and he used the attention he gained to build relationships for the program rather than for himself. When reporters came, he often deflected questions to the kids at Grandpa's table or to the volunteers who had taught him to shuffle. He taught them to be patient, how to wait until the facts were complete, to live by the arithmetic of decisions rather than the noise. Once, a few summers later, a group of children organized a small exhibition match in a community center gym. It was a modest event, folding tables, green felt, a banner that read Grandpa's Table. Parents came. Some of the same faces who had filmed that first night were in the crowd, older, a little chastened, more careful. Preston sat at the head table with a calm that felt earned. He shuffled cards, taught a pattern, joked about the watch. When the match ended, the applause was soft but full. It was not the shout of a spectacle, it was the steady warmth of people who had been seen. At closing, Denise walked to the edge of the folding table and set a small cake with 3 candles. One for the program's first year, one for William's memory, and one for the future. They sang, awkward and joyful. Thomas, who had volunteered that day, stood in the back with arms folded and a quiet smile. Richard's name had faded from the conversation, not because the lessons had been easy, but because the labor of repair had been more interesting than the gossip of collapse. That night, as the lights went out and the folding tables were stacked against a gym wall, someone turned off the neon sign. The watch on the corkboard still read 3:42. Preston took it down briefly, rubbed the cheap wart of glass at the edge, and put it back. It had become less an object of defiance than a reminder of the promise William had made. Time does not move for those who would make you small. Keep your stillness close. Years after the Penthouse, when people told the story, they did not tell it as the tale of a miraculous reversal. They told it as an example of what happens when witnesses step from the audience to the scene, when documentation meets moral courage, and when people choose to convert humiliation into something constructive. The boy who played to save his mother's job had, in the end, used the attention as a lens to build a program that taught children how to measure risk and to hold their heads level in rooms meant to intimidate them. In the slow inventory of consequences, there was one final quiet symmetry. The folding table in Grandpa's table, green felt, scuffed edges, a dented leg, was the same shape as the one used in the Penthouse. The contrast mattered. One had been set to stage a humiliation, and the other had been set to teach a life skill. The table's geometry had not changed, but the intent behind it had. That shift, an intentional repurposing of the space where power was once displayed, was the story's real twist. The thing used to diminish a life became a place where lives could be steadied. If there is a single motif that people remember most vividly besides the green felt, it is the stopped watch. Visitors to the program would ask about it, and Preston would say, as William had taught him, "Keep the stillness. Let the truth be loud on the table." It was a lesson in arithmetic and humility at once. A decade later, when reporting on the program's 10th anniversary, a journalist asked Denise what she would tell those who had watched the original clip and had felt the rush of indignation, but not acted.
Denise paused, her hands folded in the same way she had kept them the night she'd been humiliated. She looked at the kids circling the folding tables, at the volunteers teaching quietly, at the watch that still read 3:42, and said, "Don't merely be moved. Be useful. Outrage is a spark, but it is steady work that keeps the light on." The journalist asked Preston how it felt to have been part of a moment that people remembered as a puncture in privilege. He answered simply, "I learned to count my outs, and I learned to keep my hands still. The rest was learning how to help others count theirs." The story that had started in a luxury penthouse as a spectacle ended in the steady hum of a small program where kids learned to see the world as a set of solvable problems. The boys' victory at the poker table was only the first fact. What followed, witnesses arranging their proof, a staff rallying, a volunteer turning an intended spectacle into a challenge for better behavior, made the ending plausible and, for many, meaningful. As the camera that filmed the anniversary footage pulled back, it caught a scene both humble and precise. Dozens of kids around green felt tables, chattering softly about odds and possibilities. A volunteer showing a child how to shuffle without bending the cards. A woman in the back rolling up a poster about responsibility. In the foreground, Preston set a small Timex on the table. Someone asked why it still showed 3:42. He smiled and said, "It reminds us what was promised to someone we loved. It keeps us quiet enough to hear the facts." The watch, cheap and stubborn, kept its stillness. The program, resilient and modest, kept growing. Power had tried to stage a humiliation. It had been met with competence, with witnesses, and then with work that sought to restore rather than to retaliate. The twist the city remembered was not simply that the boy won the hand, but that a moment of cruelty had been converted into an architecture of care. If you found this story meaningful, consider sharing it with someone who needs a reminder that dignity can be defended and rebuilt. And if you believe in supporting local programs that teach young people decision-making, math, and respect, look for ways to be useful in your own neighborhood, the kind of help that keeps the light steady long after the hashtags have gone dark.